That is what an investment in schools is. It creates an educated, it creates an informed workforce for the future.
You're investing when you invest in education in someone's future. This isn't just about the now. It's not about the current. It's not about simply just doing something because you feel as it's the right thing to do.
In 2012, the School District of Philadelphia faced a budget deficit of over $300 million. Budget cuts resulted in counselors and secretaries losing their jobs, widespread increases in class size, and the dismantling of many extracurricular activities. Today, the school district is in a similar position. Beginning next year, the school district's deficit will begin to rise, starting at $143 million, before increasing to $320 million, $508 million, and eventually over $700 million by 2025. This is frightening, considering that the deficit may end up being over twice as large as the 2012 deficit, and the school district has only just recovered from the deep cuts 8 years ago. Today, the school district has a structural imbalance of $200 million per year. There are a multitude of reasons behind this deficit. We can start by looking at the school district's pension fund. As a result of mismanagement in the early 2000s, the state-run pension fund has now racked up $47 billion in debt. In order to compensate for this, the burden has increasingly fallen on school districts. Uri Monson, the school district chief financial officer, explains the problem simply.
The result has been in 2011, schools had to contribute 5% of someone's salary toward the pension fund, which is actually not an unreasonable amount and really fine. We now, in this year, have to contribute 34% of a person's salary. So our pension costs have gone from $65 million a year to $300 million a year.
Additionally, charter schools play a role in the financial stability of our school district. Charter school expenditures are projected to grow $114 million this upcoming year. Tamia Scipio Smith, who holds a master's degree in education policy from the University of Pennsylvania and is the K-12 policy director at Public Citizens for Children and Youth, highlights an example of how charter school funding adds unnecessarily to the school budget.
I would say, especially when it comes to the virtual charter schools, the way that we fund the schools is not very fair, mainly in terms of the fact that there are expenses that are associated with brick and mortar charter schools that are not the same as those that are virtual. And so virtual charter schools, for them to receive the same level of funding as brick and mortar schools is problematic.
Similarly, another issue with charter schools is whether the funding they're receiving is being put to good use, particularly in special education.
The real problem is on the special ed side, where even though you send money to the charters based on, for every student who has an IEP, an IEP is, it's an individual education plan. Every special education student has a plan of what the additional supports are that they require. They get a certain amount of money. There's nothing that actually requires them to spend that money on those students. So the vast majority of students they serve are relatively low need students, so speech therapy, that kind of thing, which may only cost, let's say, $15,000 instead of the $11,000 base, but they're getting $30,000 per student, so it gives them extra money to use.
That being said, there are a lot of positives to charter school funding. They have increased flexibility in their curriculums and can serve as alternatives to neighborhood schools. However, perhaps the most relevant school funding issue for the upcoming budget deficit is the loss of revenue through taxes. The school district at the local level is funded through property tax and other city taxes, including alcohol tax, rideshare tax, and sales tax, all of which will be heavily impacted by COVID-19.
You're dependent on public funds, which are going to be taxes one way or the other. Philly is even much more so, and that's because for the most part in this country, we don't give an unelected board taxing authority. Usually it's people who are going to be responsible to voters, have the ability to tax. Philadelphia School Board's appointed by the mayor, approved by city council, so they're not independently elected. No one on city council wants to give them taxing authority or make them elected. So it's even harder in Philly because you're now a step removed.
Thankfully, because the state has maintained funding for the next year and distributed the federal stimulus money as promised before COVID-19, the school district is not facing a deficit in the upcoming year. Nonetheless, there's still much uncertainty surrounding the budget. Teacher union negotiations are ongoing, there's the possibility of more federal money, and who knows what school will look like in the fall.
I now know we have 55,000 doors in the school district. Who knew? But why that's important is if you don't want people to have to touch a door to open or close it, but you know that you can't just leave it open because of fire codes, getting a foot pedal for every door. So what would it cost to buy 55,000 foot pedals, and how much time does it need to install them? And is that one of the things we have to do? We've bought thousands of thermometers, and we're looking at buying masks and all those types of things that you never thought you had to do.
Either way, preparations are still being made for the future.
So even though we're now okay for next year, the 10% cuts we started looking at in central office, we're actually going to keep looking at, because if we can start saving money now, some money we don't have to spend, that obviously will reduce our deficit for next year.
A problem with running so close to the deficit, though, is that this year the district will have limited room to address unexpected expenses, such as asbestos removal. But if cuts are necessary, the district will be ready. The district is working on putting together a set of guardrails to guide potential cuts, which will be released sometime in the future. There are also some significant differences between today and 2012. The first is the amount of time that the district has to prepare.
In this case, this is global. This is everybody and things beyond everyone's control. And so there's no sense that Philly should have been better prepared, because nobody was prepared.
Additionally, the district is better prepared to begin with.
The irony is, in some ways, we are better prepared. So we came in with what I'll call a healthier fund balance. So a lot of rating agencies recommend that you have about a 10% fund balance, 10% of your annual operating. So we have a $3.5 billion operating budget. So that would be $350 million. We did not have $350 million lying around, but we are going to end this year with about almost $160 million in the bank.
And this time won't be dealing with the crisis alone. It is also important to realize that Masterman is partially sheltered from these issues.
But I do know that Masterman would not be the same without the very effective and without our HSA. Masterman is a different community without our HSA, and that's not district driven, that's community driven.
But why do these funding issues keep coming back? And what about the fundamental problems with our school funding system? Our school system is inherently broken because of its high dependence on property tax and lack of funding redistribution.
I live here in the Northwest, I'm in Mount Airy, and if I drive north, if I drive west or north 5 minutes, I'm in Montgomery County, I'm in Flourtown, or I'm in Lower Merion. And the disparity between the property tax revenue that comes into a place like Lower Merion and thus into their schools versus the property taxes, or Springfield Township, Plymouth White Marsh, those sorts of things, versus Philadelphia, creates an enormous disparity in terms of, money that can be spent per student.
Pennsylvania is one of the worst states in the nation when you begin to look at its funding disparities.
From even the second lowest or second worst state, we're significantly worse. So there's right there, it just shows you that there's a huge problem in the way that our schools are being funded in Pennsylvania.
These policies disproportionately impact students of color and low-income students.
If things are the way that they are and they continue to be funded that way, it will be generations before those issues are in fact addressed. So Yes, I mean it contributes to racial inequity and inequity in how schools are funded on a number of levels. And again, absent a change in the law, that's not going anywhere.
Right. I wanted to highlight this graph where we see that the funding formula currently demonstrates how there's extreme racial inequities in the way we're getting our funding. We would actually fund predominantly Black districts more than predominantly white districts. That is what anti-racist policy would look like. And I know that may sound radical, but I think it's interesting for us to start to think about what is racist policy now and what would anti-racist policy actually look like.
Furthermore, not enough money is being invested in education to begin with.
You see, when we're sort of in a crisis like this, the federal government can, give out hundreds of billions of dollars or even trillions of dollars, some of which, like a lot, will go to bail out Wall Street or banks. But it seems like when it comes to education, there's not that same commitment to giving away or, giving the billions of dollars that are needed.
So, what's being done to solve these issues? Sadly, eliminating property tax from the school funding equation is nearly impossible.
The driving factor so often in real estate is schools. People work hard, earn their money, and then use that money to buy a home. And so often what goes into that consideration is, okay, I'm choosing to buy my home in this area because of the schools, and I'm willing to pay, these property taxes for these schools.
It's really hard to take it out of property tax, and for a couple of reasons. It's one of the things that gives people control. They want their schools to be a certain way, so if you want it to be as localized as possible. That's one piece of it. Tend to have higher property values, or in schools that are better, at least perceived as better, better opportunities, better options.
However, other reforms are being put in place, such as the Fair Funding Formula, which was instituted in 2016.
It looks at factors related to student population and the location where students live, and it weighs those factors. Well, and also, district-specific factors like charter school enrollment, but things like sparsity, like poverty, all of these issues are assigned a weight, and that weight weighs into something that's called the not only the average daily membership, but the weighted average daily membership of each school district. So it looks at all of those factors, and it assumes that it costs more to educate students based on how much weight there is on those factors. All the new money since the 2015-2016 school year, and by that I mean new state budget money, goes through the funding formula, which is, to my knowledge, as about right now, probably a little bit more than 10%.
Getting the remaining 90% of education funding to go through the Fair Funding Formula will be difficult.
It doesn't address the inequity as a whole because of what's called hold harmless. And it really doesn't look at school districts like as specific entities and what they need individually. And the end result is that school districts are underfunded, like the School District of Philadelphia and so many others.
Hold harmless prevents the state from reducing funding to school districts on a year-to-year basis. Getting rid of this policy would benefit the poorest school districts in Pennsylvania immensely, redistributing around $1.17 billion in funding, something that seems like common sense.
It's like, obviously, the school district that has no English language learners or no students in poverty is likely going to have different funding needs than a district that speaks 86 different languages.
The Philadelphia School District, for example, would gain $334 million in state funding, but at the same time, removal of the policy would harm roughly half of Pennsylvania students, albeit ones in generally wealthier districts to begin with. One way to soften the blow would be to ease the state into the new system, having 10% more of state funding to go through the system each year, a solution that has already been proposed by the Basic Education Funding Commission. However, in the end, the solution to our school funding problem is going to need to be as big as the problem itself.
But it is a really complex issue, and no one's come up with a really good solution to it yet. And the simple fact for most of it is there's just not enough money in the system, period, to fully fund education. So no matter what, someone's going to have to pay more, whether they're paying it through state taxes or local taxes. So you need more money in the system, and then you need to distribute it equitably.
But a ton more money wouldn't hurt.